Today is the 7th of July, 2025, a full century since a moment that promised so much for Ireland but delivered so little. The story of the Irish Boundary Commission is one of high hopes, political manoeuvring and ultimately a crushing failure that has left a long, dark shadow over the island. It's a tale of lines on a map that became deep divisions in society, a wound that has festered for 100 years. For many, the Commission was meant to be the final, logical step in Ireland's long and bloody journey to self-determination, a chance to correct a border that had been drawn in haste and with little regard for the people it was meant to divide. Its failure wasn't just a political disappointment, it was a profound betrayal felt in the bones of communities from Derry to Newry. This whole saga is a crucial chapter in understanding modern Ireland. It explains how the partition of the island, initially seen by many nationalists as a temporary arrangement, became a permanent and painful reality. The Commission was the mechanism that was supposed to soften that hard edge, to ensure that the new border reflected the wishes of the inhabitants. But as we'll see, the path from that noble idea to the cold, hard reality was fraught with pitfalls. The story is packed with characters who were out of their depth, with secret deals and public outrage. It's a reminder that history isn't just about grand treaties, it's about the real people whose lives are forever changed by the ink on a page, or in this case, the lack of it. To get to the bottom of it, we need to go back to the early 1920s, a time of immense turmoil and fragile peace following the Irish War of Independence. A new state, the Irish Free State, had been born, but its northern counterpart remained part of the United Kingdom, creating a border that sliced through towns, farms and parishes. The Boundary Commission was the great hope for nationalists on both sides of that new line. They believed it would be their salvation, a process that would see vast, nationalist majority areas handed over to the Free State, leaving behind a much smaller, more politically manageable Northern Ireland. This hope, however, would soon curdle into a bitter sense of abandonment that would fuel conflict for generations to come. As we mark this centenary, the story of the Commission feels more relevant than ever. The arguments over sovereignty, identity, and the practicalities of a border on the island of Ireland have come roaring back to life in the age of Brexit. The ghost of 1925 still walks the borderlands, a constant reminder of a promise that was broken. Understanding what went wrong 100 years ago is not just an academic exercise. It's essential for grasping the deep-seated tensions that continue to shape the political landscape of these islands. It's a story of a missed opportunity of catastrophic proportions, and its echoes are still being heard today. To understand the immense hope placed in the Boundary Commission, you have to picture the Ireland of 1921. After years of guerrilla warfare, Irish and British leaders sat down to hammer out a deal. The resulting Anglo-Irish Treaty was a hugely controversial document. It gave 26 counties in the south and west a form of independence as the Irish Free State, but it left the 6 counties of the northeast as Northern Ireland, a self-governing region within the United Kingdom. For Irish nationalists, led by figures like Michael Collins, this partition was a bitter pill to swallow. They only agreed to it because they saw it as a temporary measure, a stepping stone to a fully united and independent Ireland. Their great hope rested on one specific part of that Treaty Article 12. This article was the clause that promised the creation of a Boundary Commission. Its job, as stated, was to determine the final border in accordance with the wishes of the inhabitants, so far as may be compatible with economic and geographic conditions. For the Irish delegation, this wording was a massive win. They looked at the demographics of places like County Fermanagh and County Tyrone, which had clear nationalist majorities, and believed it was inevitable that these large territories would be transferred to the Free State. In their minds, Northern Ireland would be reduced to a much smaller entity, perhaps just 4 counties or even less, making its long-term survival as a separate state unworkable. This belief was not just wishful thinking. It was the central argument used by pro-treaty leaders to sell the deal to a sceptical Irish public. Michael Collins himself famously argued that the treaty gave Ireland not the ultimate freedom that all nations desire, but the freedom to achieve it. The Boundary Commission was the key instrument for that achievement. It was presented as a fair, impartial process that would sort out the messy border issue once and for all. Nationalists living in border areas like South Armagh, South Down and the city of Derry clung to this promise. They had been left on what they felt was the wrong side of the line, and they waited patiently for the day the Commission would arrive and deliver them into the new Irish state. So the Commission was born from a political compromise, a tool to make an unpalatable petition acceptable. It was meant to be the final act of the revolutionary period, the moment when the map of Ireland would be redrawn along democratic lines. The expectation across nationalist Ireland was sky high. They envisioned a peaceful transfer of territory that would right the wrongs of the initial partition. This wasn't just about moving a line on a map. It was about national destiny, about reuniting communities and fulfilling the dream of a 32-county republic. The stage was set for a historic redrawing of the border, but the foundations on which these hopes were built were far shakier than anyone realized at the time. When the Boundary Commission finally got down to business in late 1924, its fate would be decided by just 3 men. On paper, it looked like a balanced affair, with 1 representative each from the British government, the Irish Free State and Northern Ireland. But in reality, the Commission was deeply imbalanced from the very start, a fact that would prove fatal to its mission. The composition of this small group, their backgrounds and their motivations would shape the entire process. It was less a panel of impartial judges and more a clash of competing interests, where 2 of the members were far better equipped for the fight than the third. This imbalance of personality and legal skill would define the Commission's work. The man in the chair appointed by the British was Richard Feetham, a highly respected South African judge. Feetham was the very picture of colonial establishment authority. He was meticulous, legally minded, and brought a judge's sense of procedure and precedent to the table. While he was supposed to be the neutral arbiter, his entire worldview was shaped by the British Empire. He saw his role in strictly legalistic terms, prioritizing stability and economic considerations over the messy, passionate wishes of the inhabitants. His interpretation of the Commission's remit would consistently favor a minimal conservative approach, completely at odds with the radical redrawing that Irish nationalists were banking on. Representing Northern Ireland was Joseph R. Fisher. He wasn't just a unionist, he was a staunch and vocal one, a barrister and newspaper editor who had spent his career defending the Union with Great Britain. Fisher was there for one reason, and one reason only, to ensure that Northern Ireland lost as little territory as possible, and maybe even gained some. He was sharp, politically savvy, and worked full-time on the Commission's business, ready to argue every point and challenge any proposal that threatened the integrity of the state he represented. Alongside Feetham, he formed a powerful bloc. Both were legally trained, both were dedicated to the task full-time, and both fundamentally favoured the status quo. And then there was the Irish Free State's man, Ian McNeill. In stark contrast to the other 2, McNeill was a scholar, not a lawyer. He was a distinguished historian and a co-founder of the Gaelic League, a man of immense cultural standing and personal integrity. But he was utterly out of his depth in the legal and political snake pit of the Commission. Crucially, he kept his day job as Minister for Education in the Free State government, meaning he could only dedicate his time to the Commission on a part-time basis. He was, by all accounts, an honourable and well-meaning man, but he was a guileless academic pitted against 2 hardened legal and political operators. This mismatch would have catastrophic consequences. Ian McNeill's role on the Boundary Commission is one of the great tragedies of this story. He was a man of principle, a patriot who cared deeply for his country, but he was completely the wrong person for the job. His approach was defined by a sense of academic detachment and a strict, almost naive belief in his own impartiality. Instead of acting as a robust advocate for the nationalist case, as J.R. Fisher was doing for the unionist one, McNeill saw himself as a neutral judge. He believed his duty was to rise above the political fray and help the Commission reach an objective conclusion. This was an honourable stance, but in a process that was intensely political, it was a disastrous one. His lack of legal training was a huge handicap. Richard Feetham, the chairman, established the ground rules for the Commission's work, and his interpretations consistently narrowed its scope. For instance, Feetham decided that Article 12 did not mean holding big plebiscites or votes across whole areas like Tyrone and Fermanagh. Instead, he insisted on looking at tiny administrative units, like parishes or even townlands. He also ruled that economic and geographic conditions were just as important as the wishes of the inhabitants, and even decided that the Commission had the power to transfer land from the Free State to Northern Ireland. A sharp lawyer would have fiercely contested these interpretations, but MacNeill, the scholar, simply accepted them. One of his most critical failings was his lack of communication with his own government back in Dublin. MacNeill took the Commission's confidentiality to an extreme. He barely told his cabinet colleagues, including the head of government W.T. Cosgrave, what was happening in the meetings. He didn't warn them that the proceedings were going badly for the nationalist side, or that Feetham's rulings were steering the Commission towards a minimalist outcome. The Dublin government was left completely in the dark, still assuming that large transfers of territory were on the cards. They were operating on blind faith, completely unaware that their man on the inside was being comprehensively outmaneuvered. This combination of passivity, a misplaced sense of judicial duty, and a failure to communicate created a perfect storm. MacNeill watched as the Commission drew up a new boundary line that was 1,000,000 miles away from what nationalists had hoped for. In fact, he initially agreed to the proposed new line in principle. He saw it as the logical outcome of the flawed process he had accepted from the start. It was only when the reality of the situation was about to become public that he seemed to grasp the full political catastrophe he had presided over. By then, it was far, far too late. His resignation would come only after the damage was done, a final, desperate act from a man who had been placed in an impossible position. From the very beginning, the process of the Boundary Commission was fundamentally flawed, with the odds stacked heavily against the nationalist position. The problems began with the wording of Article 12 itself. The phrase, "in accordance with the wishes of the inhabitants, so far as may be compatible with economic and geographic conditions," was a classic piece of ambiguous diplomatic language. For nationalists, the wishes of the inhabitants was the most important part. But for Unionists and the British establishment, the get-out clause was the economic and geographic conditions. This ambiguity gave the chairman, Richard Feetham, all the room he needed to interpret the remit in the most conservative way possible. Feetham's early rulings set the tone for the entire affair. He made a series of crucial decisions that effectively killed off any chance of a major redrawing of the border. First, as mentioned, he ruled out plebiscites. This was a massive blow. Nationalists had assumed that entire counties would get to vote on their future. Instead, Feetham decided the Commission would look at tiny, granular districts, making it impossible to transfer large, coherent blocks of land. This approach favoured keeping the border largely as it was easier to argue that small, isolated nationalist areas were not geographically compatible for transfer. It was a classic case of death by 1,000 cuts, or in this case, 1,000 administrative boundaries. Furthermore, Feetham's elevation of economic and geographic conditions to the same level of importance as the people's wishes was a game-changer. This allowed the Commission to argue against transferring a nationalist area if it meant, for example, cutting a railway line that served a unionist town or disrupting the economy of a particular region. In practice, this clause was almost always used to prevent territory from moving to the Free State. The economic and geographic integrity of Northern Ireland was given priority. The Commission even decided it could transfer territory from the Free State to Northern Ireland, a possibility that had never even crossed the minds of the Irish negotiators in 1921. The evidence-gathering process itself was also problematic. The Commission travelled through the borderlands, hearing deputations from local groups. But the whole affair was conducted in a quasi-legalistic manner that favoured well-prepared, legally advised unionist groups over more grassroots nationalist ones. With Ian MacNeill failing to challenge the process or the chairman's interpretations, the nationalist case was effectively going undefended from within the Commission itself. The whole procedure was a slow, grinding process that was steering towards one inevitable conclusion: a report that would recommend only tiny, insignificant changes to the border, betraying the hopes of hundreds of thousands of people. By November 1925, the Boundary Commission had secretly finalized its recommendations. The new proposed border was, honestly, a political bombshell just waiting to explode. Far from handing over huge swathes of Fermanagh and Tyrone to the Free State, the Commission proposed only minor adjustments. A few nationalist areas would be moved into the Free State, but to the absolute horror of nationalists, some areas of County Donegal, part of the Free State, were to be transferred to Northern Ireland, supposedly to improve the geographic coherence of the northern state. The net result was a tiny loss of territory for Northern Ireland, an outcome so far from expectations it was almost laughable if it weren't so tragic. Before the official report could be published, disaster struck for the commissioners. On the 7th of November 1925, the staunchly unionist British newspaper The Morning Post published an accurate and detailed leak of the Commission's findings. A map was printed showing the proposed new border. The leak was a political earthquake. In Dublin there was disbelief, which quickly turned to fury. The Irish public, who had been assured for years that the Commission would deliver a nationalist victory, felt a profound sense of betrayal. The government of W.T. Cosgrave, which had been kept in the dark by its own representative, was caught completely off guard and plunged into a massive political crisis. The public outcry in the Free State was immediate and overwhelming. Ian McNeill, now exposed, was seen as either a fool or a traitor. He had been comprehensively outwitted, and the result was a national humiliation. The pressure on him was immense. Realizing the catastrophe he had overseen, McNeill finally acted. On the 20th of November, he tendered his resignation from the Commission, and a few days later from his cabinet post as Minister for Education. His resignation was an admission of failure, but it was too little, too late. He had failed to write a minority report protesting the findings before the leak, effectively giving his tacit approval to the new line. The leak forced everyone's hand. The Cosgrave government in Dublin knew it could never accept this new border. The political fallout would have destroyed them. The British government, seeing the crisis unfolding, wanted to avoid further instability in Ireland. And the Northern Ireland government, while quietly pleased, was also keen to have the matter settled. The leak had made the Commission's report toxic. There was no way it could ever be implemented. The three governments were now faced with a stark choice: deal with the political fallout of the leaked report or find a way to bury it forever. The dream of a border drawn by the wishes of the inhabitants was officially dead. The leak of the Boundary Commission's report created a political crisis that required a swift and decisive solution. With the report now public knowledge and utterly unacceptable to the Irish Free State, the three governments, British Irish and Northern Irish, scrambled to contain the damage. They convened an emergency meeting in London in December 1925. The aim was no longer to redraw the border based on the Commission's findings, but to find a way to make the whole problem disappear. The result was a new agreement that would have profound and lasting consequences for the island of Ireland. The Commission and its ill-fated report were to be unceremoniously killed off. In a remarkable political deal, the governments agreed to suppress the Boundary Commission's report entirely. It would never be officially published. In its place, they signed a new treaty that did two main things. First, it revoked Article 12 of the original 1921 treaty, the very article that had created the Commission in the first place. This meant the existing provisional border, the one drawn up in 1920, would now become the permanent international frontier between the Irish Free State and Northern Ireland. The line on the map that nationalists had been told was temporary was now set in stone with no hope of future revision. The second part of the deal was a financial arrangement designed to make this bitter pill easier for the Free State to swallow. Under the 1921 treaty, the new Irish state was liable for a share of the United Kingdom's enormous public debt, much of it accumulated during the First World War. In the December 1925 agreement, Britain agreed to waive this obligation. For the financially struggling Free State government, this was a significant concession. It allowed W.T. Cosgrave to return to Dublin and present the deal not as a complete surrender on the border, but as a pragmatic agreement that secured the state's financial future. It was a political fig leaf to cover the humiliation of the Commission's failure. For the hundreds of thousands of nationalists who lived in the border counties of Northern Ireland, this outcome was a catastrophe. They had been abandoned. The promise made to them in 1921 had been broken. Their hopes of being incorporated into the Irish Free State were extinguished overnight. They were now a permanent minority in a state whose very existence they opposed, left to face decades of political and economic marginalisation. The deal may have solved a short-term political crisis for the governments in London and Dublin, but for the people on the ground, it entrenched the division of their country and solidified their position as a stranded community. The border was no longer a temporary line. It was a permanent fact of life. The failure of the Boundary Commission was not just a diplomatic embarrassment. It was a pivotal moment that directly contributed to decades of instability and conflict in Ireland. The sense of betrayal among northern nationalists was deep and lasting. They felt that the Dublin government had sold them out for financial gain, abandoning them to their fate in a hostile state. This feeling of abandonment eroded trust in constitutional politics and created a fertile ground for more radical and militant forms of Irish republicanism to grow. The idea that the border could be removed through peaceful political means had been tried and had failed spectacularly. Within Northern Ireland, the confirmation of the border as permanent solidified the sectarian nature of the state. The Unionist government, now secure in its territory, felt little need to accommodate the large nationalist minority it ruled over. For the next 50 years, nationalists in Northern Ireland faced widespread discrimination in housing, employment and political representation. The electoral boundaries were gerrymandered to ensure Unionist control, even in nationalist majority areas like Derry City. The state was run, as one of its prime ministers famously said, as a Protestant parliament for a Protestant people. The grievances that would eventually explode into the Troubles in the late 1960s had their roots right here, in the failure of 1925. The civil rights movement that emerged in Northern Ireland in the 1960s was a direct response to this systemic discrimination. People were marching for basic rights: one man, one vote, fair allocation of housing, and an end to discrimination. But when this peaceful movement was met with state violence, the situation quickly spiraled into open conflict. The Troubles, a brutal 30-year conflict that cost thousands of lives, was fought in large part over the very existence of the border that the 1925 Commission had failed to change. The Irish Republican Army, or IRA, sought to remove the border by force, while loyalist paramilitaries fought to defend it. The line on the map had become a bloody battle line. Even after the Good Friday Agreement of 1998 brought a fragile peace to Northern Ireland, the legacy of the Boundary Commission endured. The agreement created complex power-sharing institutions and acknowledged the legitimacy of both Irish and British identities within Northern Ireland, but it did not remove the border. Instead, it made the border virtually invisible, allowing people and goods to cross freely, which helped to ease tensions. The failure of 1925 serves as a stark lesson in what happens when political settlements ignore the wishes of the inhabitants and leave deep-seated grievances to fester. The ghosts of that failure haunted Northern Ireland for the rest of the 20th century. As we stand here in 2025, 100 years on from the Commission's collapse, its story has a chilling new relevance. For nearly 2 decades after the Good Friday Agreement, the Irish border had faded into the background of daily life. It was an open, seamless frontier, a symbol of a new era of peace and cooperation. But the United Kingdom's 2016 vote to leave the European Union, or Brexit, dragged the Irish border right back to the centre of a massive political storm. Suddenly, the old, difficult questions about customs posts, checks, and the very nature of the border were back on the table. The ghost of 1925 had returned. The key challenge of Brexit was how to manage the new EU-UK border on the island of Ireland without resurrecting the hard infrastructure of the past. No one wanted a return to checkpoints and customs huts, which were not only economically disruptive but also powerful symbols of division and a potential target for dissident Republicans. The ensuing years of fraught negotiations between the UK, Ireland and the EU produced the Northern Ireland Protocol and its successor, the Windsor Framework. These complex arrangements effectively kept Northern Ireland aligned with some EU rules to avoid a hard land border, but in doing so they created a new kind of border in the Irish Sea, between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. This modern-day wrangling is a direct echo of the problems the Boundary Commission failed to solve a century ago. It demonstrates just how intractable the issue of placing a border on the island of Ireland truly is. Once again, we see the clash of identity, sovereignty and economics playing out along that same line on the map. The debates over the protocol have exposed the same deep divisions between unionists, who feel their place in the UK is being weakened, and nationalists, who see the new arrangements as a step towards greater all-island integration. The fundamental problem, how to reconcile the conflicting aspirations of the two communities, remains unsolved. Reflecting on the centenary of the Boundary Commission's failure is therefore a sobering exercise. It teaches us that borders are not just lines on a map. They are living, breathing things that shape the lives and identities of millions. The failure of 1925 was a catastrophic missed opportunity to create a more stable and equitable settlement. It entrenched partition, abandoned a generation of nationalists, and sowed the seeds of future conflict. 100 years later, as Ireland and the UK still grapple with the consequences of that division, the story of Ewan MacNeill, Richard Feetham and their failed commission serves as a powerful and enduring warning from history.